Good morning, everyone. I'll just wait one moment for everyone to find their seats. Well, good morning. On behalf of the Association of Jewish Refugees, welcome to day 2 of the International Testimony Forum. A special welcome in particular to those of you who did not join us yesterday. We're so pleased to have you here, and also pleased to see those of you who were indeed with us yesterday and have opted to come back for more. I am Alex Maws. I'm head of education and heritage at the AJR, and I'm really excited to be opening today's proceedings in particular because you'll have seen on your programs that today is the day that very much focuses on the intersection of testimony and education. Before I start, and I'm sorry to begin the day on a bit of a sad note, but I feel it's important to tell you that we got word late last night that a longtime AJR member, Ruth Danson, passed away. Ruth had a remarkable story. She was one of the Kindertransport refugees who attended the legendary Bunce Court School. There's a lovely photo on our website with Ruth on hand as we unveiled an AJR blue plaque honoring that school's founder, Anna Essinger, just a few years ago. It's especially fitting to mention today that both Ruth and her husband, Charles, also recorded their testimonies for AJR's Refugee Voices Archive, which is, of course, a poignant reminder of why we are all here at this forum. May her memory be a blessing. A few just brief housekeeping point, really. There have been a couple of minor changes to the program in terms of chairs of different sessions. It has been updated on the online version, so those of you who were here yesterday will know that you can just scan the QR code that's on your folder to access that. Those who are first just joining us today, please do go ahead and scan that. You'll find the program and biographies there for all the sessions. Friends, in the 20-plus years that I've been working in the field of teaching and learning about the Holocaust, people have been asking with increasing urgency how we will educate when there are no longer survivors to share their testimonies in schools. Now, these in-person talks haven't really been a focus of our forum thus far, but it's come up a bit. It's not always a straightforward delineation between the two different types of experiences. And by way of providing some educational context for today, I'd like to take a slight diversion in that direction for just a moment. So yesterday, during a panel discussion that was ostensibly about the experiences of those who were involved in recording testimonies, Eva Clark, who I saw come in here just a moment ago, a child survivor, described how she first began sharing her and her mother's story in schools. It turns out she literally responded to an advert in the newspaper placed by the Holocaust Educational Trust. She had an initial talk with them, she said, and then, in Eva's words, she hasn't stopped talking since. Now, this characteristically modest comment of hers doesn't really do justice to Eva's tireless work. Over the past generation, Eva has been one of, if not the most prolific speakers in British schools. And beyond that, she herself played a key role in building HET's outreach program, which sends Holocaust survivors into schools to share their testimony. At its peak, 10 years ago or so, that outreach program organized around 600 survivor visits to schools per year, an absolutely remarkable number. Several people in this room have worked on that program over the years, and can I just say they have my total gratitude and respect, not to mention the gratitude of so many survivors who felt they were finally given a voice by that program. Other organizations, notably the Holocaust Survivors Friendship Association, the National Holocaust Center and Museum, the now defunct London Jewish Cultural Center, also organized similar talks at various times, so they're owed our appreciation as well. Now, there are no precise figures, but let's say during that several-year window of this peak period, maybe around 1,000 schools all totaled had visits by Holocaust survivors per year. Really interesting academic research has been done on those talks, highlighting their educational impact as well as their challenges. I myself have learned a lot from Dr. Alistair Richardson of University of Winchester, who joins us here today, whose research has highlighted that hearing from a survivor in person made for a more concrete encounter with the Holocaust as a topic than, for example, passively reading testimony from a textbook. Hearing from a survivor in person, he found, made young people feel more emotionally connected with the events of the Holocaust. It tended to make students consider the contemporary relevance of the testimony. They also felt that they were privileged to hear testimony in a way that would not be possible for much longer. I can imagine this sense of privilege had its educational benefits, but also challenges. Similarly, his finding that hearing the everyday details about family life before the war, for example, really helped young people connect with the particularity of the testimony. This too could be both, I think, quite pedagogically beneficial and also a bit problematic at the same time. It's a fascinating area of study, and given how central the idea of in-person survivor testimony has been to our understanding of what teaching and learning about the Holocaust consists of, I understand why so many people take an interest in it, and I understand why that leads to this sense of angst when it comes to the question of how we will teach without it. But here's the thing. There are approximately 7,000 secondary schools in the UK. So let's say that for some period of time, that peak period of time, 1,000 schools had an in-person survivor talk. That means that even then, 6,000, the vast majority, did not. And although I'm referring specifically to British schools right now, I think it's safe to say that this is also the case in the other countries that are represented here today. So where does this looming sense of existential dread about teaching in the post-survivor generation stem from? On that same panel yesterday, Kurt Marx made an almost offhand remark that I think gets to the heart of it. He said, "It's been almost 100 years." His quote was, "I don't know how much longer young people will be interested after we're gone." That's it, I think. Of course, in-person survivor talks would have made a major impression on those relatively small number of students who experience them. But statistically, it's highly unlikely that across the entire education system, they themselves move the proverbial needle of knowledge and understanding in a significant way. But on a sort of social psychological level, we cannot help but assume that teaching in a world where survivors are no longer living as our neighbors, as our fellow citizens, is going to be a world in which it's going to be much more difficult to make young people form a personal connection with the topic. Our collective relationship with the Holocaust is just going to feel different. And that does matter. I hear and I understand Kurt Marx's concern. In the first session of the day yesterday, Sarah Jones talked about the significant role of testimony in teaching and learning about the Holocaust. Research by the Institute of Education and others has often highlighted that testimony, not in-person testimony now, but written testimony, video testimony, etc., is very, very commonly used in classrooms. And this is great news, because I think that in spite of some of the challenges raised by Tony Kushner and others yesterday about the ways in which testimony can often obscure our knowledge about the ways about our knowledge and understanding about the Holocaust, I think we can all agree that testimony plays some important role in how students ought to learn about the Holocaust. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA, recommendations on teaching and learning about the Holocaust, which I encourage all educators to read and adhere to, states, use witness testimony to create a unique link to the past. In addition to learning about history, incorporating first-hand witnesses' testimonies help learners understand how events impacted the individual. So where we land is that the majority of Holocaust educational resources and guidance for teachers guidance for teachers already does rely heavily on testimony, and it almost certainly always will. So this is to say, yes, of course, the declining number of eyewitnesses to the Holocaust is incredibly sad. Of course, it will bring about a perceptible change in which we are, in the world in which we are teaching. But it will not, I don't think, necessitate a fundamental rethinking of how most teachers go about teaching about the Holocaust. We're already well equipped in that regard. And the future, I think, looks promising. For the benefit of those who weren't here yesterday for Lord Pickles' excellent keynote address, he made a very important announcement that the UK will create a new portal where recorded British Holocaust testimonies from a range of different institutions and archives will be centrally accessed. Today, we'll hear a lot about how various organizations are putting the tens of thousands of recorded testimonies that exist in the world to educational use. We'll hear about how these recordings are being used to underpin technological platforms and literature and second and third generation talks. In brief, we will hear about how experts in our field are moving from perennially asking those existential questions about the future of Holocaust learning to answering them. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to grappling with those critical issues with all of you. So, thank you for listening. And with that, let's go right into our first session of the day, chaired by Karen Pollock from the Holocaust Educational Trust. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, we just had to have a photo apparently, so there was that slight lull. Good morning, everybody. As you heard, my name's Karen Pollock, and I run the Holocaust Educational Trust. And I really, before I introduce our speakers and hand over to them, I did want to just say on behalf of everybody here, and everybody was here yesterday, how fantastic it's been so far. We really value what you're doing at the AJR, and convening these conversations has been of great value so far to us. And I do think today in particular will be even more interesting and challenging for us as we approach, as Alex referenced, a critical time. I do want to thank, though, in particular, Alex, Michael, and Bea, because I know the work that goes into this, and I know also we're delighted just to be in these auspicious surroundings. Something I did want to say is that when we're hearing from experts, and perhaps this is going to be slightly repetitive, but I'm not surprised that I might echo some of what Alex has already said. We're hearing from experts around the world. We're hearing from eyewitnesses themselves and their families. We're talking about how testimony has been captured, how it's preserved, how we grapple with how it is used, has been used, is used, and will be used in the future. And this is something that for those of us who are the practitioners working in the field of education in the classroom is something that we are constantly thinking about and challenging ourselves about. And as Alex said, there is probably angst around it on a human level, a personal connection to these incredible people that we've had the privilege to get to know and hear from, but also about that connection and the impact we can have in the classroom. I've spent a number of years, decades, working at the Holocaust Educational Trust, working with survivors who've entrusted us with their stories, mainly in the classroom, but also in a non-formal environment, whether with the Premier League or, football clubs or on social media. So on a personal level, and I think on behalf of conversations today and yesterday, but the conversations today will be very useful as we approach this critical juncture where we're moving from living history to history. So really, my job today is to chair the panel. You won't be hearing much more from me. I'm going to introduce each speaker as they come up. There will be time for questions afterwards. And this morning's panel is on curating Holocaust testimonies in the digital age. So the first person we're going to hear from is Dr. Parry-Jones. Kai is the digital archivist and data manager for the UK Holocaust Memorial, the memorial that's going to be built next to Parliament. So Kai, I'm handing over to you.
Right, there should be, do I press the next button, do I? Thanks. Yeah, there we go. Okay, it's fine. So thank you, Karen, for that introduction. So as Karen said, my name is Kai Parry-Jones, and I'm the digital archivist and data manager for the UK Holocaust Memorial Programme, which has been delivered by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which is a government department. And we work together with our advisory board, the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation, to create the Holocaust Memorial in Westminster for the UK. And today I'm going to talk specifically about a testimonies project that was conducted by the foundation between 2015 and 2016, which was the project that Natasha Kaplinsky was talking about yesterday, just to provide you with a bit of context. So first of all, I thought I would talk a bit about myself, not for vanity purposes, but I just thought it would provide you with a bit of information about my involvement with the project and my involvement with the memorial and the testimonies project itself. So I joined the project 3 years after the testimonies project concluded in 2019. And as Karen said, I work as a digital archivist and data manager. And lots of people, even in this conference over the last 2 days, have asked me, what does that actually involve? So I'm primarily involved with the curatorial team for the permanent exhibition that will appear in the Learning Centre of the Memorial. And it's going to be an audiovisual and multimedia-led exhibition. So my role primarily is to manage and oversee all the multimedia content that we're acquiring from partnering archives and organizations across the world to create this exhibition, because we are not an existing museum or organization, so we don't actually have, apart from the testimonies collection, we don't actually have our own unique collection. So we are working with partnering organizations in order to make this exhibition a reality. And I also have a background as an oral history curator. I worked as an oral history curator at the British Library. So with that background, it was a kind of natural fit for me that I would act as the custodian of the 112 Holocaust testimony interviews that Natasha Kaplinsky mentioned yesterday. And I'm also a trustee of the Oral History Society. Next. So before I talk about the Testimonies project itself, I thought I'd just give you a kind of brief background about the UK Holocaust Memorial. I'm sure most of you in this room are aware of this project, but some of you might be less familiar with it. But essentially, it is a proposed national memorial to commemorate the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children who were murdered in the Holocaust, together with all other victims of Nazi persecution. And the intention is for it to be located in Victoria Tower Gardens, next to the Houses of Parliament in Westminster, down the road. And as I mentioned, it will feature an audiovisual exhibition, but specifically it will explore the history of the Holocaust from British perspectives. So that plurality of the word perspectives is really important, just because we are providing a warts and all exhibition. So it's not going to be a purely celebratory exhibition, which some people think it will be. It's actually going to be a very honest and critical exhibition that will look at Britain's relationship with the Holocaust. So all of this goes back to the Prime Minister's Holocaust Commission, which Natasha mentioned yesterday, which was established by the then Prime Minister David Cameron in 2014. And it was a cross-party commission that was tasked with establishing what more Britain could do to ensure that the memory of the Holocaust is preserved and that its lessons that it teaches are never forgotten. And this was supported by 2 expert groups looking primarily at education, but also memorials and commemoration activity. And their results were published in a report called Britain's Promise to Remember, which is freely available online as a PDF, so I do encourage you to have a look at that. And the report essentially had many recommendations, including the establishment of a National Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre for the UK. But also one of the other recommendations was that an urgent programme was needed to record and preserve the testimony of British Holocaust survivors and liberators of concentration camps. And it was felt especially urgent at the time, just because, as we are aware, we are moving from this time of first-hand personal testimony to an era, as we are exploring today, to the era of the user and the digital age. So the UK HMF Testimonies project, as I said, was conducted between 2015 and 2016. And as you are aware, Natasha Kaplinski was the interviewer for this project. And there were 112 interviews produced in total. But 113 people were interviewed. So there was one interview that was conducted with siblings. And these are with British Holocaust survivors, refugees, and also with 8 Bergen-Belsen liberators. And there was also one interview with a Roma survivor. And the people that took part in this testimony project were a mixture of interviewees who had already recorded their testimony, so were quite well versed with the idea and familiar with the idea, but lots of people had never recorded their testimony before. So this is very much a unique collection in a sense that we hear from individuals who have spoken up for the first time. And again, as I said, you know, the idea of the project was to record the survivors and liberators before they sadly passed away. And you know, since the project has taken place, around 70 of the people who participated in the project have sadly passed away. And these interviews were filmed by a professional documentary film company called Atlantic Productions Limited, who are famous for producing David Attenborough documentaries and many other programs for the BBC. And they were interviewed primarily in film studios in London, but they were also conducted in interviewees' homes in the UK if they weren't able to come to London. And the interviews themselves, so there's roughly about 200 hours worth of footage, and they're all completely audio-visual. And the interviews do vary in length, but on average they're about 1 hour and 45 minutes each, with the longest being roughly about 3.5 hours. And the focus of the interviews is very much on the Holocaust experience of the individual, but they are conducted with that kind of life story methodology in mind. So we do hear about their pre-war experiences, but also their experiences after the Holocaust as well. And there were lots of questions as well that Natasha Kaplinski and the project at the time decided that they wanted to ask all interviewees. So there is a kind of a repetition of certain questions that do appear in the testimonies, such as why testimony is important, and as Natasha said yesterday, you know, have we learned any lessons from the past and so forth. And the ages, so the average age of the interviewees at the time was 87. So we are mainly getting the perspective of 10 to 16-year-olds during this period. The liberators, obviously, some of them being a bit older. But as we see here, the oldest interviewee was born in 1917, and the youngest was born in 1944. So as I said, these are audio-visual interviews. They were filmed, and I'm not a videographer, but they were filmed in your kind of standard 2D camera. So very familiar with most of us in this room today. But also the project at the time was inspired by the Shoah Foundation's work in capturing 3D testimony. So multiple cameras were used during filming in order to capture these interviewees in 3D. So the technology exists, and the outcome and the produce that's resulted from this project means that there is an opportunity here to use these interviewees as interviews in a 3D format, if they so wish. And also they were recorded in 6K resolution, which is a very high resolution format. And just to give you an idea that, typically when you go to an exhibition, if you are viewing high definition recordings, they are typically filmed in 2K resolution. So that just gives you an idea of the high quality of the resolution of the filming. And as you can see from all the images I've shared so far, these interviews were filmed against large green screens, and essentially the reason for this was to allow for flexibility depending on the output of these interviews in terms of the type of storytelling that you would like to tell. So there's an opportunity here to provide different backdrops behind the interviewees as they are telling their testimony. And again, this was very much inspired by the Shoah Foundation's work, because as I'm sure you're all familiar with testimonies themselves, lots of them are filmed in interviewees' homes, and there tends to be a static background behind them. It might be their living room, it might be their dining room, or they might be in an office or other spaces. So there's an opportunity here to be flexible, essentially, with how you use these recordings in future. And I've got two examples here where there's this first one is available online via YouTube, which was used by the project at the time to promote the project. And there's an example here of using archival material as a backdrop. And then the other example I've got here is a static grey background, which has been used for educational derivatives of the original interviews that were filmed. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a second. All interviews were conducted with artifacts in mind. So every interviewee was encouraged to bring in a selection of artifacts that meant something to them, that was important to them as part of their story. Not all interviewees brought artifacts with them, but the vast majority of them did. And there's a few examples here. They primarily consisted of family photographs. A few people did bring in objects that they discussed, but also things like identity documents like passports and visas, especially those refugees who came to the UK in the 30s and the late 30s. And the interviewees themselves, so we're often quite used to hearing testimony, I think, in the UK from certain countries, particularly Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. But what these interviews do provide, which is quite interesting, is this kind of pan-European perspective. So we do have examples from slightly more unusual places, like Italy, and also what is today Serbia, but then Yugoslavia. But the vast majority of the interviewees, as we can see, came originally from Germany, Poland, Hungary, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. And the 8 that are represented from the United Kingdom are those British liberators who liberated the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And this is just an example to provide you with an idea of the different types of experiences that interviewees were discussing. What would be quite fascinating is with all the transcripts that were produced, it would be quite interesting to put that through some kind of machine learning software and produce a word cloud just to see what the main terms and phrases and locations are that come out of these interviews. But essentially, it's there just to provide you with an idea that there are many different perspectives provided in these interviews. And also, what's quite interesting, as we all know, is that everyone's Holocaust journey is different, but also some of these places overlap in an individual's testimony. So there will be camp survivors who were in ghettos, for instance, and so forth. And another interesting aspect of this project is, as I mentioned, quite a few people in the project had been interviewed before, and some of their interviews are already existing in other collections, both in the UK and abroad, primarily in the United States. And I had noticed yesterday on the programme, Peter Summerfield appears on the front cover of the programme for this conference, and Peter Summerfield was interviewed for this project. So there's a real opportunity here, I think, and with the announcement yesterday from Lord Pickles that there will be a portal to be able to cross-reference these interviews and work out, what interviews exist for one individual in order to get a sense of how these interviews differ over time. Because as Bea said yesterday, an interview is very much a product of a time and place and a specific context. So there's a real opportunity here for researchers, I think, to be able to cross-reference these interviews. I'm also in the process of archiving these interviews with the National Archives. So all 112 will be archived at the National Archives in Kew, where they'll be preserved in perpetuity, ensuring that the testimonies will endure for generations to come. And as well as archiving, we will be providing access to these interviews via the National Archive online, via their Discovery online catalogue. And it's worth noting here that the interviews that will be archived and provided access to at the National Archives are the raw interview files from the original interviews themselves. So the way these interviews were filmed, if you think about the way a documentary film is made or a production is made, they include a lot of repeated questions, outtakes, and also breaks as well. So Bea was talking yesterday about how you don't often in testimony interviews get to see the behind the scenes and things like that. This is very much the case with these interviews that will be available at the National Archives. So it's not your typical kind of streamlined, I hate to use the word production, but I hope you know what I mean by that. These are essentially raw interviews where you will get repetition and you will get time for pauses as well, and those conversations that don't necessarily happen within the official interview itself. So there's a real opportunity here, I think, for researchers, but also documentary filmmakers to be able to access this material and do something potentially different with it. But also, there are plans for these, as Natasha said, for these interviews to appear in the Holocaust Memorial exhibition. So there's a concept image here of how potentially these interviews will be used in the exhibition. But this is very much a concept image, so what you see here won't necessarily be the final product. But the intent is for these to have a home in the the memorials exhibition. And I also mentioned educational derivatives. So all of these 112 interviews, as I mentioned, were filmed in a kind of raw format, which obviously serves a certain type of user, but probably not that accessible for educational use. So the project has created educational versions of these interviews, which essentially doesn't include the outtakes or the stop-starts or the green screen conducted with the original interviews. But they are essentially packaged together so that people are able to follow them from beginning, middle to end with an uninterrupted natural flow throughout. So those are the plans at the moment for future access. And I'll end there with a visual of an aerial visual of the proposed Holocaust Memorial in Victoria Tower Gardens. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you. I'm going to hand straight over to Jody Spiegel, Director of the Holocaust Survivor Memoirs Programme at the Azrieli Foundation in Toronto.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everybody. You can understand my accent? We're okay? Okay. Okay. So, I'll work harder. I'm going to share a little bit about the work that we do at the Azrieli Foundation's Holocaust Survivor Memoirs Program, particularly what we do in education, and then I'm going to share some reflections about testimony and sort of riff off of what Alex was opening with earlier. So the Holocaust Survivor Memoirs program is completely funded by the Azrieli Foundation. David Azrieli himself was a Holocaust survivor who was lucky enough to have his memoir published because his name carries some weight in Israel, the Azrieli Towers. He's, quite a builder. And so his memoir was published by Yad Vashem in the early 2000s. And with that, a weight was lifted for him. He said he felt like he was liberated for a second time in having his book out in the world. And so he began a program, and I started there 18 years ago with the Holocaust Survivor Memoirs program. We established it in 2005 to collect, preserve, and share the written first-hand accounts of survivors who made their way to Canada after the war. All the memoirs, in order to be eligible, must be written by the survivor themselves. So not with a child, not from a audio or video recording and then written down. The survivor themselves had to have written it in their own words, in any language, at any time. So we have memoirs that were submitted to us that were written in 1945 in Hungarian that we translated. We have a one-page poem. We have a 900-page handwritten account that was written when somebody retired. And they had to have come to Canada. So maybe they've moved on to live in Florida or Israel, as often is the case. But they had to have lived some of their lives in Canada. Once the manuscript is submitted, we have a fact-checking process that we go through. We do this because of denial and distortion. We don't want anyone to ever open up the book and say, actually, that date is wrong, the account is wrong, the whole thing is garbage, which was a concern at the time. The fact-checking process is quite detailed, and it's a whole other discussion to have about memory and memoir and what is fact and what is memory. So we also edit. We edit to keep the survivor's voice strong, but we edit because for when it's a translation, it needs an edit. But even for those whose English sometimes was their 8th language and they wrote it in English, they need help forming the thought. Often the survivor in the past was able to read the final account that we've produced to then give us their blessing before we move ahead with it. We've published 123 survivor stories. The work that we did in the beginning was, look, we have books, and now they're free. All the books are free to every school across the country in Canada and every university. So that means if a teacher needs 40 copies for their class this year, and then next year needs another 40 copies, we will send it. We've sent over 750,000 copies of books across the country. Everything we do, we try and do in French as well, as Canada is a bilingual. We don't create versions of books, and so sometimes the stories are quite heavy, and we recommend they're for 16-plus readers, but sometimes it's a story of somebody in hiding who then gets reunited with their family and talks about what it was like to live a life in hiding or pretend to be a Christian girl. And those stories are sometimes appropriate for a younger age. So the work that we did in the beginning, I'm going to go back. Okay. So the work we did in the beginning was books. Books, books, books. Who doesn't love a book? We learned that kids don't like books. And so teachers love books, but students often don't like reading a whole book. And so we thought, okay, we can help teachers. We'll give them something more. So in 2011, we set out to film the survivors who were well enough to be filmed. It was not a testimony project. When I brought this idea to the board of directors at the Azrieli Foundation, David Azrieli looked across the table at me and said, Jody, you're not Spielberg. What are you thinking? And I said, no, I don't want to be Spielberg. And some of these survivors had been filmed by USC Shoah, but for us, we needed something extra to add to the story, something where they would meet the author, taste a little bit of the story. We had no intention of telling the entire story in video format. It was not what we do. Other people do that. We don't. So we went to film, and some of the stories, these people are writers. They chose to write. some didn't get filmed by USC Shoah. And so they said, no, I don't want to. I wrote my memoir, it's done. Some of the survivors had passed, and so we didn't have that opportunity. And an example there in the corner, in the middle, is Helena Yokel. We came to film her, and someone mentioned something like this yesterday. We came to film her. She wrote her memoir years ago for her family often. But when we went to go film her, now that we were publishing her book, her family sat upstairs weeping, her older adult children, and they said, "You're too late. This is not," and we realized as we were sitting there that she had a bit of dementia, and the stories, she told started not making sense, which to us, we had the book, so we knew where she was going, but she never got there. So we realized that the work that we did, we have these short films, and we have turned them into short films, 6 minutes. We've added animation for some of the films, because how do we keep students interested? How do we get them to want to read the book? So we realized that what we had was so many hours of filming. We tried not to keep it to no more than 90 minutes with the survivor. It's a lot to ask. We're not, again, USC Shoah Foundation. And so we wanted to just get a little taste, but we ended up with video footage, now a full memoir. We have artifacts, family photos, and so we created a resource that we call Recollection, which was a tool for exploring survivor testimony, and it's all done in a safe space. So a teacher can let their students go on. There's no graphic images. There's nothing that basically a student around 12 or 13 years old won't be able to handle. It's war, it's the Holocaust, but there's nothing graphic. There's nothing too scary. There's no discussions of torture. And you can search, this video? I don't know if we need to actually watch this. We don't need the volume here.
Exploring the history of the Holocaust.
No, here we go. The volume comes on.
Through the first-hand accounts
Anyway,
of
this is it.
survivors.
You can look through it with
Visitors can explore survivor stories.
survivor stories, or you could go through it with themes. So if you wanted to learn about hidden children or life in a ghetto or what pre-war Jewish life was like, you can look just at that and explore that. And we did this, we started realizing that we would get calls. Oh, great, we have your books, they're in the library, they're amazing. Can you send us a survivor? Okay, so we realized, well, we had the time, we will do it. And so we decided, okay, we will send a survivor, we will travel to, I can say this here, but I can't say this in Canada, the middle of nowhere in Canada to bring you a survivor. So not only are these students not ever seen a Holocaust survivor, they've probably never met a Jewish person. And so we said, yes, but the deal is this, you have to read the book. You read the book, we're gonna come out. So at times when that couldn't happen, we said, okay, we can do a Zoom, we could do a Skype, remember Skype? And we gave the teachers the opportunity to not read the whole book by creating a biography page and an author activity. And the students can then take the time to walk through Recollection to fill this in, to understand who they were about to meet. Because in Canada, it's not, every province has its own way of ministering education. It's not done in the same way that across the board, and it's really sad that it's mandatory, but it can be just, we put on Schindler's List, check, done. So how they teach the Holocaust is really from a Canadian perspective, often in high school and often from the role of Canada's role in the war. So whether a teacher chooses to give you a definition of the Holocaust or spend 3 weeks in a unit study, it's up to the teacher. So you could leave with only understanding that this was something bad that happened to some people during World War II. So we realized that while we had all these books, teachers needed a lot more. So the first thing we did and everything we said was, okay, you teach the Holocaust and then read a memoir. And we realized when we surveyed teachers that they weren't doing that. They didn't know where to go and how to do that. And I said, wonderful. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has the teaching and learning recommendations. They talk about the what, why, and how to teach in 80 pages. Teachers don't like to read also. So 80 pages is a lot. And so we took it and really distilled it down to something we call the first step, because we kept on saying, well, the first step is teach the Holocaust. So this is the guide for the teachers to prepare. It's 12 pages. It's almost like a little workbook. We hold their hand through it. We're hoping it's the least they could do, but you know. And we sort of created an understanding of what we're talking about, the core content here, things that you need to think about. You may not need to teach this. This may not apply to the class if you're talking about hidden children, or you're talking about, you don't need to talk about Auschwitz if you're talking about hidden children. But you need to know what you're talking about. And then we had full education programs where it was 4 lessons based on an anthology. So we published an anthology about life, 3 different Canadian survivor accounts about rescue. We have an education program. Same thing with hidden children and identity. It's based on a number of different books. And this way we spoon-fed the teachers. Here, this is how you can do it. Step 1, you learn about what the Holocaust is. Step 2, we have all of these resources. Short activities. You want to learn about Auschwitz in 2 hours? Here we go. We really work nationally, bilingually, to make this as easy as possible. When we had all of our footage of our survivors, we thought about archiving it, and so we gave it to USC Shoah Foundation and worked on a couple activities with them through Eyewitness. Eyewitness has its drawbacks, and I can talk about that at another time. We just launched an exhibit called Education Disrupted, which includes memoir, video, photo, all about education before, during, as a form of resistance, and after survivors who went back to university went back to high school after the war in Canada, after the war when they came to Canada. It's beautiful, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it. And what I didn't include here was just this past January, we also launched our first 5 audiobooks. And 4 of them are narrated by the Holocaust survivor themselves. They're, I think, according to Penguin Random House, which we publish our own books, but Penguin Random House Canada took our audiobooks because they've never seen anything like it. And they said that these are the only audiobooks that had been narrated by the Holocaust survivor themselves, which is quite amazing. We have an educational philosophy, which is also on our website, and we all know the importance of first-person stories as a way to develop all this understanding around Holocaust. It creates historical empathy, understanding the context is important, thinking about critical topics. But I actually want to talk about how in approaching history one story at a time, we realize that survivors often share the stories that they want told. As opposed to the diaries of the victims who were murdered during the Holocaust that are sort of frozen in amber, the memoirs and testimonies of survivors unfold in relation to the shifting narratives of life, how they choose to remember. Memoirs and diaries, oral histories, video testimonies must be recognized as texts which are constructions and reconstructions of experiences. They never offer us this unmediated access or a truth about the Holocaust. We want to be inclined to privilege rare, immediate testimonies written in the moment during a period of great risk. As James Young claims, it's untenable to ever insist that the body of literature written in the Holocaust is more factual or even more authentic than those written by survivors after the fact. So in working with a variety of testimonies, I want to share an example. The Buried Words is the diary of Molly Applebaum. Molly Applebaum's memoir was published in 2017, together with her wartime diary. It's a unique document in which the author records the sexual encounters with her adult rescuer. Her memoir is written in the late 90s and makes no reference to this abuse. It's raised many questions for us on memory, trauma, and testimony. We gave Molly, who is completely cognitive and healthy, the opportunity to remove some of the content of the diary. We discussed whether it would have ramifications for her cousin and her family, her late cousin Helen, and we spoke to one of Molly's daughters to discuss whether Helen's family would want to be involved in the process, and Molly gave us the go-ahead to publish the diary alongside her memoir. The diary, written between 1942 and 45, Molly's 12 to 14. It's a painful, fragmented testimony of a child in German-occupied Poland. The diary begins in the Tarnow ghetto and mostly unfolds on the farm of her rescuer. The memoir, written between 1998 and 2001, is Molly's life story up until 2001 when she injured her hand and had to stop writing. We see that Melania, which was her name before she became Molly, was a resource to Molly in writing her memoir. She quotes it at some point, but Molly stresses on different elements of her trial, and she's left out one of the most shocking, difficult elements of the diary, a word for which she does not have the right language to describe, and she coins her own Polish term to describe it. This term means her sexual relationship, first between Victor, the rescuer, and her cousin, and then with herself. And she describes it as strategic, transactional, and even at times romantic. But it occurs under duress and extreme violent circumstances. We may have a different word for it today. When we submitted the memoir, the testimony to USC Shoah Foundation, sorry, I'm going to go back. We went to go film Molly, because that's often what we do when a survivor's living, and we asked her if we could talk to her. And she said, yeah, absolutely. We came to her small home, her small apartment, and her little personal space with bright lights, a male film crew, and there were just so many different factors at play. And when we asked Molly about her life, and she just talked and shared in what was life, she said that the relationship was a form of entertainment, that it helped pass the time. She never describes the encounters as a power imbalance or abuse. And yet when we sent this video testimony to the USC Shoah Foundation, it was archived and labeled as rape, sexual assault. We insisted those labels be removed. Molly didn't call it that. We don't know what it was like, and we can't assume. And we also don't know if Molly maybe feels like it was rape and assault, and this is the story that she has to live with. We need to consider all of this when we look at all the variety of testimony and accounts that exist. Despite the passage of almost 80 years, most survivors will tell you that it felt like it was almost yesterday that the Holocaust happened. But as we speak to younger audiences, we know that's not the case. It seems to be ancient history. You look at a video and you see an old person with an accent, not like my accent, a different accent, but an older person in clothes, not like my clothes, not like the students' clothes. And yet, we assume that there's a connection. Over 40,000 survivors came to Canada after the war, and it changed its landscape. And this event is daunting to educators, especially as we get farther away from it. Teachers are overwhelmed by the enormity of the topic and the task of creating relevancy for students. In terms of modern history, which the Holocaust is part of our modern history, it might as well have been 100 years ago. To an 11-year-old who thinks that Facebook is old and can't imagine a time without a screen, the Holocaust might as well be the French Revolution. There also seems to be outrageous demands placed on Holocaust education. There is no other area in the curriculum, at least in Canada, that students are expected to learn the details of the history and are given a call to action. Be better, change the world, be responsible. We don't do this with any other genocide. I'm just going to say this. We don't do this with any other time in history that we say, what can we learn? What is the lesson of the French Revolution? Nobody does this, but there's a lesson of the Holocaust. We have to do this. Is that appropriate? In January, right before the pandemic in 2020, we surveyed Canadian educators to ask what challenges they face in teaching the Holocaust. Not many of them do teach it, and when they do, we found that when it's a priority in their classroom, they do not feel confident, even those who've been teaching it for so many years. And so while teachers still try to talk about the Holocaust, they are not teaching the basic facts and the foundations. Who are the Jews? Do Jews still exist? Holocaust awareness is different than Holocaust knowledge and just knowledge about the Jewish people. 3 generations since the end of the Holocaust, we're grappling with how to teach this watershed event, recognizing with what must change as the connection to Holocaust survivors across the generations change. Technologies will keep evolving as they do, but I believe our basic human currency is a story. And while it's increasingly harder to get a teenager to read a book cover to cover, it's those narratives. You get absorbed in the voice of another person. It was written as a voice of a 14-year-old. I'm 14 and I get it. That can forever change you. We at the Azrieli Foundation have been left with the legacy of 123 survivor stories. We have about, 20 more to go. And then we have some anthologies to pull together. But as the writer Richard Powers wrote, the best arguments in the world won't change a person's point of view. The only thing that can do that is a good story. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. That was really, really interesting. And I think for lots of people who are thinking about how we teach about the Holocaust in schools and our approach to testimony, I think a lot of the questions you've explored and are asking are questions that we're also asking ourselves. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Shannon Biederman, Senior Curator at the Sydney Jewish Museum. Shannon.
Just waiting for my presentation.
Okay, and bring the microphone slightly.
Oh, can you hear me? Sorry, I also have a bizarre...
Oh, if you just press
the green button.
If you press it, it might just be there.
There we go. Oh, fantastic. So thank you so much for having me here. I am so grateful to be able to share with all of you. Testimony is something that I have been thinking about for over a decade. And I just want to say that it's not just me at my organization. I wish that my colleagues could be here as well. We do have a department called Community Stories that is dedicated to recording oral histories in the traditional sense in which we've been talking the whole of life. They also help survivors publish their memoirs in lots of different ways. So what I'm sharing with you today is a very particular lens because I work in curatorial. So my mandate is exhibitions, and that is what I'm really focused on. But I'm pretty sure many of you may have thought it was weird that there's a Holocaust museum in Sydney. Like, what is that doing there? But in fact, you might not know that the Sydney Jewish community has one of the largest per capita proportions of Holocaust survivors anywhere outside of Israel. 60% of Australian Jewry were foreign-born after the war. Everybody knows a Holocaust survivor or is related to a Holocaust survivor, and the memory is very strong in my community. So my museum was founded 30 years ago by Holocaust survivors as a place to share their testimony, to advocate for democracy, for freedom, and to memorialize those who they have lost. It's our 30th anniversary year, and I have been at the museum for 18 years. And when I started, there were always Holocaust survivors on the floor. Any visitor who came would meet one of these living witnesses. I actually love this picture. This is Lottie Weiss, and this is a photo taken of her in Auschwitz. And she has an incredible story, and she would sit every single Sunday right next to her photo and speak to visitors. And time again, our visitors talked about what a personal, communal, memorable museum ours was. But this is something, particularly for those of us who have been there a long time like me, we feel it's slipping away. It's getting harder and harder for us. So we still have about 40 Holocaust survivors who actively come and share their story. There is a little bit of a difference in Holocaust education in Australia. We see about 30,000 school students a year. Every single school student meets a Holocaust survivor. 90% of students in my state will come to my museum at some point. So we have saturated the market, and it is incredible. But it has filled us with a lot of angst about what to do without them. Because the fact is, we don't do it without them at this time. So that has led to a lot of questions about how do we keep this connection alive? How do we keep this experience personal? Can we keep this experience personal through testimony? And so we have tried a lot of things over the years. We developed an app called Voices in 2016, which allows you to, it uses Bluetooth beacon technology. So as you go through the displays, you can automatically hear from survivors at pertinent junctions talking about their experience. Once you've listened to the Holocaust survivor testimony, you then have the opportunity to hear more testimony. You can hear from witnesses, perpetrators, historians, people who are working in human rights, educators, curators. This is audio only, so we also had to do video as well. So we have video listening stations in the ghetto section, in our camp section, in Reichwald, that allow you to watch clips pertaining to all different topics on these areas. Now, this material primarily draws upon the USC Shoah Foundation's archive, which has been an incredible resource for us. We have recorded our own testimonies over the years, but their indexing is much better than ours. But the question kept coming up, are we ready for the future? Have we done everything that we have wanted to do? And so that led us to do some major filming projects. So we did one in 2018, we did one in 2020, as well as another one, we actually did two in 2020, in which we filmed 43 Holocaust survivors. Now, the technique that we used was quite different than previous ones. They were filmed from head to toe, so you see their full body, which is just an incredible way to witness testimony because you can see every gesture. You can see them kick their feet as they get nervous. And we had a very brilliant, I think, director of photography. And he created a 3-camera rig for us. So we had 2 cameras in full portrait mode in stereoscopic pairs, which would allow us to create a dimensional image if, the future cases arise. And then we had a 3rd camera mounted on top, which got a nice, very tight close-up of their face. And this is great. These were 6K cameras. We can talk about data management because that is an issue for us. And these interviews, we also did slightly differently. So there were 3 parts to the interview. So the first section was a traditional, somewhat retelling of their story, somewhat like they would normally do for groups. And this was about 45 minutes to an hour. We then took a break, and the second part of the filming was more of an FAQ. So we asked them pertinent questions or stories about their experience that we wanted to capture, as well as questions that we asked across all interviewees. We then took another break, and we asked them about objects, because we are a museum, and that is one of our main interests. But we were very interested in the medium, because we had found that, particularly in developing our Holocaust displays, the material from the USC Shoah Foundation, while a wonderful resource, the quality, the backgrounds, it just wasn't really working. And we were getting very interested in volumetric capture, which led us to partner with the USC Shoah Foundation in their Dimensions in Testimony project. So we actually, a silver lining of COVID was, because they had to stop recording, that we were able to bring the rig to Australia. We still have it there. And we recorded 6 Holocaust survivors for the project. as well as, well, we had it set up, we did a whole bunch more interviews, because why not? And this was, even though we came at this project because we were interested in the volumetric capture, I do have to say, these interviews are really incredible. They are unlike anything that we've ever done, because we never have time to spend an entire week, 20 hours, asking people about their lives. And the questions that the Sower Foundation they are very interesting, and they actually allowed us a bit of a guise in which we could ask things that maybe we wouldn't have felt comfortable asking. I've known Olga here for 18 years, and there's some things I know she doesn't like to answer, but I could be like, oh, well, the UST Shoah Foundation said that we had to. So it gave us actually a lot of liberty, and we learned things about our survivors that we had never known, which then led to this exhibition that we developed called Reverberations, A Future for Memory. Now, I think that this exhibition is probably the most important exhibition that we have done. Not only is it an homage to our survivors in our 30th year, but it is the first exhibition that we've done that focuses solely on survivor testimony. It has survivor testimony has been at the core of everything we've done, but we've never dedicated an entire exhibition to it. But I think I should also say that in this year, it is also an incredibly important thing that we do, because what we wanted to do is to imagine a testimony exhibition without survivors. And this was their opportunity to come and to critique and to see how we were using their material, so that, you know what, in the future, we have the opportunity to change it. We have the opportunity right now to record more material, because, you know what, we all work very closely together, and we do this jointly. We had some very exciting news. My museum is going to be doubling in size. We're building a whole new institution. And as part of that, we do have plans to create a permanent testimony exhibition. And so doing it right now allows us time to test to see how these different ideas are coming across with visitors. And so the mandate of the exhibition isn't history. We have a whole Holocaust history exhibition, but it is about creating a human connection by making these stories personal. And that was the priority in what we do. So the testimony and the framing texts in this exhibition are quite different. The framing of the exhibition is more of a commentary on the role of memory in society, and how it shapes us, how it informs us, because we have a problem for us in Australia, especially with our students. We are very far away from the events of the Holocaust, both in a physical distance, but also in time. And they do not understand why it's important. But for the Sydney Jewish community, you actually have to understand this history if you want to understand the community. You will not know who the Jews of Sydney are today without it. And so their students don't necessarily understand when there's a swastika graffitied on the wall, the impact that that has on, one, the many survivors that are in the community, and two, their descendants. And so in this exhibition, we really focus on today. Oh. I could have let you read the framing text. So when you enter the exhibition, there is a lenticular wall that says, "Why do you share your story?" And when you look back, it is all 43 survivors we filmed responding to that question, as well as some brief biographical information. You then can enter a space where there is 5 85-inch monitors, so all of the interviewees are shown almost close to full size, and they are talking about questions about today. Is it difficult to share your story? What is the continuing impact of your experience? Can you forgive? Was there justice? And it cycles through these 8 questions, and I have to say this is my favorite part of the exhibition, and it was really interesting to do, because at once, each survivor comes across as an individual. They all have a diversity of an opinion, which is important because we didn't want them to be a monolithic group. We wanted them to be individuals. But at the same time, editing all of their stories together, there was a power to their responses, and quite often I had to go back and check the transcript to be like, did they really all say that? It was extraordinary. So then, once you go through this part of the exhibition, you have the opportunity to see 3 of our interactive biographies, which we developed in conjunction with the U.S. Seashore Foundation. Now, we've been very fancy with our technology, and sometimes it's a problem. You see here these domes, these are actually array microphones. And so what that does is when you step under them, when your voice hits a certain decibel, it triggers the software. And so there's actually no buttons you have to press. It is somewhat of a seamless conversation with a Holocaust survivor. It is very interesting to see people talking to them. Once you get through, there is a section where you can we give people the opportunity to make some meanings. So they can leave a message to our Holocaust survivors. Our Holocaust survivors do read them. For those of you, since they definitely love the messages. And I think looking next, we are going to spend this next year evaluating to see whether or not this exhibition is making the impact that we hope it will have. But then in future, I am looking to do a 2nd and 3rd generation project, because I really think in the reverberations and looking at how the Holocaust impacts future generations, these voices are integral. We've started our preliminary interviews. So, the first step, and then in January, I will be looking at doing a very major kind of big setup recording in January. So if anyone is doing 2nd or 3rd generation interviews, I would love to hear about your project. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. Our final speaker is Dr. Anika Reichwald, curator of the Jewish Museum in Hohenems.
Thank you.
Sorry, my pronunciation.
No, it's perfect. Thank you, Karen. You pronounce it perfectly fine. But I will in a short minute explain where Hohenems is, just for those of you who have never been there. At the beginning, there is the question of an end, the end of an era. The era of the direct testimony of all those who survived the National Socialist persecution and violence. This question has preoccupied us for decades. After all, it is the question that has provided the impetus for countless projects, foremost interviews with survivors. Today, there are only a few left who can tell of the atrocities committed by the National Socialists, but thus contemporary witnessing, Zeitzeugenschaft, and with them. In 2018, the Jewish Museum Hohenems, which you can see here, which is located in Hohenems, a small town in Western Austria, close to the border to Switzerland, Germany, and Liechtenstein, together with the Flossenbürg concentration camp memorial, which is also located in the periphery in northern Bavaria, very close to the Czech border, and together with the Foundation Remembrance, Responsibility and Future in Berlin, we all came together to think about an exhibition project on how to deal with survivors' testimonies. 3 institutions at different locations, sometimes peripherally situated, sometimes centrally located, with different social functions and tasks, were united by the desire to open up new perspectives on testimonies. For what remains, and there was no doubt about it for us, are precisely these narrated memories of the survivors, which we already encounter today whenever a thematization of the Holocaust can be assumed. The result is the exhibition Ende der Zeitzeugenschaft, with a question mark, or End of Testimony, which was opened firstly in Hohenems in November 2019 and is touring ever since through German-speaking Europe. It is a bilingual exhibition, by the way. In the following minutes, I would like to give a brief insight into the initial ideas of the exhibition, such as the definition of Zeitzeugenschaft, or contemporary witnessing, and the question of our approach towards video interview material. Furthermore, I would like to sketch the structure and content of the exhibition's modules and explain the overall exhibition concept as a traveling exhibition. Zeitzeugenschaft, contemporary witnessing, is a multidimensional phenomenon. From our point of view, this phenomenon includes not only the survivors as narrative actors, but also those institutions or initiatives that commission interviews, as well as the interviewers on the other side. But also, should we take in account the interview setting, the associated technology, the recording, processing, storing, digitizing, and ultimately representing the testimonies, again in educational institutions such as a Jewish museum or museums, a memorial site, or an educational institution and programs. All of these factors are part of Zeitzeugenschaft, of contemporary witnessing. Hence, the exhibition focuses less on the historical content of what is told, but rather asks about its how. How is an interview conducted? How is it recorded or preserved? How can the memory of what happened be given expression in a narrated story? How does the role of the survivors and the social function of their testimonies change? How can we think of a culture of remembrance without contemporary witnesses, only on the basis of their testimonies? Approaching these questions, the exhibition is divided into 3 thematic blocks. First, a look behind the scenes of the eyewitness interviews, followed by second, a historical outline of the ever-changing social role of survivors and their testimonies, and third, a look at the respective considerations and the handling of the topic of eyewitnesses by the exhibiting institutions. The exhibition begins with an irritation, the silence of the survivors, a composition of interview excerpts that acts as a gentle break with the often existing notion that the survivors are so-called talking heads. This part also reflects on the role of us, those who watch and listen, and our expectations towards the survivors. So what happens when the survivors remain silent instead of telling their story, when they do not deliver what is expected of them? A similar approach can be seen in the module Something Made, in which a compilation of different interview sequences also allow a look behind the scenes of the interviews or conversation situations. Here we show technical as well as human interruptions, as James pointed out yesterday, the unexpected appearance of a person asking a question, misunderstandings in language or content, coughing, a sip of water, laughing, etc. One could call them the outtakes. We've heard that before today. But all these moments are part of an interview. They are part of contemporary witnessing. For the nuances, interruptions, and irritations in the survivors' interviews that are not shown in the professional history documentaries of the major broadcasters, exhibitions, and education programs tell us sometimes even more about the dynamics of the conversation and the participants than the curated, edited, made excerpts. This part of the exhibition shall allow the visitors to get a sense of the overall picture of survivor interviews and what and how they are made of. Another important aspect of Zeitzeugenschaft for us was the process of how an experience becomes a memory and later a story. Therefore, we show a selection of short interview sequences which present different strategies of narrated memory. They are an indication that memory cannot be recalled chronologically, but rather functions associatively. Images, sounds, smells, all of these can trigger memories. To then arrange these pieces and reproduce them into our story is a feat that all of us accomplish every day. The selected interview sequences thus make it clear that there is not one narrative about the Holocaust, precisely because, and we heard that yesterday as well, the backgrounds, biographies, and experiences of the survivors, as well as their memories of what they had experienced and the chosen narratives, differ from one another. These sometimes come across as a moral appeal, as a success story, sometimes as an emotional moment. But each one of these narratives is a different perspective on the Holocaust, individually experienced, remembered, and told. I'm so sorry, we had a bit of a problem with the fonts because we converted a PDF into a wonderful PowerPoint presentation. Alongside this first module, the second module, a historical outline of the exhibition stretching from the mid-40s to a present day, illustrates how the role of the survivors and their testimonies has changed steadily in recent decades. Three factors, which are mutually dependent, influence the constantly redefining social and media role of survivors, first as eyewitnesses, later as actual witnesses, and last but not least as contemporary witnesses, Zeitzeugen in German. These include first the survivors' self-representation, how they present themselves and report on their experiences. Second, the socio-historical context in which they give their testimony, for example, under which circumstances, political and social conditions they can and are allowed to appear and speak. And finally, third, the different forms in which a social perception of and a reaction to the survivors and their stories is reflected. At the same time, this historization of contemporary testimony also illustrates the advances that media technology development has undergone in recent decades. From the typewriter to the hologram, the exhibition points to various formats of testimonies that have been filled by Holocaust survivors for over 7 decades. Such as the first public interview of a Holocaust survivor on stage on the American TV show This Is Your Life in 1942, or witnesses at court, for example, in the Eichmann trial, we saw that yesterday, or the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt in the 1960s. But also the many appearances in classrooms, talk shows, as movie characters, and so on since the 1990s, and nevertheless, the digital 3D holographic projections or reinvented characters on social media as we have witnessed it in the last few years. As I have tried to show, the exhibition focuses on the testimonies, their process of creation and their presentation in the media. Therefore, from the very beginning it was a purpose as a traveling exhibition to give the opportunity to different venues to draw from their own collections and encourage them to work with their material, with their sources. The showing institutions are asked to critically examine the material and thus to establish a local or regional reference when using testimonies from their context within the exhibition frame, namely the first and the last module, which I will talk about in a second. Furthermore, we have been working with interviews produced by our cooperation partners, but also from well-known institutions such as the UC Shoah Foundation, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, thank you, James, by the way, the Fortunov Archives of the Yale University, the Association for Jewish Refugees, thank you, Bea, but also interviews from memorial site collections, major educational and cultural institutions, and broadcasters. The exhibition, and that is the third module, concludes with a section called Institution and Contemporary Witnessing, and shows the different approaches of the exhibition institutions towards testimonies. At the Jewish Museum Hohenems, you can see it here in the image, we at the time asked the questions, who will have the power of interpretation and carries the responsibility for an appropriate presentation once the survivors won't be able to act as a corrective to their own narrative anymore? And how to deal with the responsibility of already using interviews with contemporary witnesses in exhibitions or educational programs, and for this, although with the best curatorial intentions, to intervene in them and ultimately to recontextualize them narratively. The Flossenbürg concentration camp memorial, as well as the Munich Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism, focused, when they showed the exhibition, on the future of testimony and showed critical approaches towards the already mentioned 3D holographic projections of survivors, as well as various digital projects regarding testimonies. The Jewish Museum Augsburg-Schwaben gave an insight into their past and ongoing projects with survivors explicitly focusing on the second, third, and fourth generation. and their narratives. Meanwhile, the Centrum Judaicum in Berlin and the great Oranienburger Straße synagogue was asked what shall be remembered, questioning the importance of different memories by many various Jewish communities as it is the reality in Berlin society today. Who is remembering what? And to what extent is one specific memory shaping the cultural remembrance rather than other memories? The exhibition is currently shown at the House of Austrian History in Vienna in the Hofburg, the former Emperor's Palace, as you can see on the images. There we tried to show the massive variety of initiatives and projects working with survivors connected to Austria in one way or another. Since the 1970s, actually, and that is especially interesting since the historic appraisal of Austria's role between 1938 and 45 had really only begun in the 1990s. So let me finish with a final thought. The exhibition ties in with questions about a reflective approach to institutions, collections, and holdings, and can be considered an invite to think about how the future of Zeitzeugenschaft, contemporary witnessing, might be shaped. For example, by taking a fresh look at existing material, by using the latest technical achievements in ways that are often open to question, or by adopting new scholarly perspectives and asking new questions. Therefore, I'm very excited to see which institutional approaches will come to light, especially looking at the next stations of the exhibition. We are traveling until 2026 and open for interested emails. As you can see, there is still a lot to do and to show and to reflect on. And to be honest, at this moment, I'm for once pretty sure that we certainly have not reached the end of contemporary witnessing, but rather look at an interesting future together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anika. You'll all be aware that we're running slightly late on our timetable, so I do apologize, but we're not going to have time for questions, which is such a shame because we've had some really excellent contributions. But you'll have an opportunity to talk to our panelists in our 10-minute break before, or 15 minutes, I don't know, I'm looking at, 20-minute break. Oh, there's no break. Oh, we're going straight in. Forget about that. Forget about that. There's no break. We're going to go straight into the next session. But I did just want to say something before handing over. The first thing is, I think the key thing that our panelists demonstrated was this question about responsibility that we all feel around testimony. There are different approaches, but there are many commonalities. The care for our survivors and for our eyewitnesses, understanding our audience, the purpose of the testimony, and its use. There's such fascinating work going on that we've witnessed going on around the world and that we all have the privilege to be a part of. And these were fascinating contributions from Anika, Shannon, Jody, and Kai. So as you heard, we don't get the opportunity to ask questions right now, but we will do after the next session and have some really good discussions then. So thank you very much.